I'm Helen Zimmerman. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Wake County, and welcome to our timely topics. This timely topic is going to be about the 2024 North Carolina general election analysis. And I'm not sure how many people we have now. As I said, we had 70 people register, but we may not have that many. We're going to take just a minute to say a couple of things about the League of Women Voters before we get to our guest speaker. We're very proud to have Karen Brinson Bell here tonight. We'll be back with her in just a second. So we have a couple of things we always say about the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters was founded in 1920, shortly before the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote was signed. Our core principles are to empower voters and defend democracy, and we always do it with a nonpartisan viewpoint. The League of Women Voters is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we are strictly nonpartisan. We do not support any political party, and we do not support any political candidate. We even refrain from engaging in discussions of a partisan nature. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Karen Brinson Bell, the Executive Director of the North Carolina State Board of Elections. Karen has been in this position since 2016, so she has lived through two of our general elections here in North Carolina. As the North Carolina's chief elections official, Karen Brinson Bell leads about 65 full-time employees, which are charged with administering elections and campaign finance compliance, overseeing the election and ensuring voting for more than 7.8 million voters. She is a multifaceted leader with nearly 2 decades of experience implementing and administering elections, voting systems in local, state, and national roles. Please welcome Karen Brinson Bell, and we are going to try to switch this, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Karen's going to share hers.
Yes, great. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you. So you have the floor if you can share your screen. I've made you a co-host.
Yes. Now I just need to go into my slide mode.
Perfect.
There we go. And apologies for my background for those who are seeing me on the video portion. I am in my spare time, I say jokingly, I have been taking one class towards my master's in public administration and I have class tonight. So I have to be on time at 6 o'clock. So the easiest way I could do that was to be in my car. But I am stationary. People worry about that with me sometimes. I'm parked in a safe parking space. So very glad to be on, though. I have done work when I was outside of this role. I've done work with the League of Women Voters. And of course, during my time as executive director, we have collaborated on some things. So really appreciate the opportunity. So I'm going to try to go through just some of the key aspects of what we faced with the 2024 general election. I've got some numbers, but I really look forward to being able to answer questions. So definitely put those in the chat so that I can answer as best I can what's most pressing on your mind. So just by the numbers, as we went into this general election, we were at about 7.8 million registered voters. That was certainly up from even the 2020 presidential election, which meant we also had the most ballots ever cast in our state for actual number of ballots. We had over 5.7 million ballots cast for this election. And remarkably, we broke a record for early voting with 4.2 million early votes cast in this election. And we had nearly 300,000 absentee by mail ballots that were cast, with about 1.2 million cast on election day. Now, of course, this looks a little different than where we were in 2020. We still had more votes cast during early voting in 2020, but more people used the method of absentee by mail because of the pandemic. But this was more in keeping with where we have been in prior elections, actually up by about 100,000 for absentee by mail. We were just shy of 200,000 in the 2016 presidential election. But that interest in the early voting method in North Carolina continues to grow and continues to be our most popular voting method. So overall, our turnout was not quite 74%. So we say we were at 73% turnout overall for our state. 2020 was actually our largest turnout in modern history. We were at 75% turnout in 2020, but 73% is still comes in second and is still remarkably high given the number of individuals in our state. And then, it's always of interest who had the highest turnout. The counties get even a little competitive about this. That award goes to Chatham County with over 82% turnout for their registered voters. There's a lot of information I could report on how the demographics, the parties, and so forth break down. And much of that is available on our state board website. But I think particularly of interest is the voter turnout by age group. It's probably the area we get asked most in some ways. And so you can see that the age group between 41 and 65, we had about 2.4 million voters in that age range. People are also often curious as to whether young voters are going to turn out in presidential elections. And you can see, we were a little bit low on the number of about 600,000 in that age group of 18 to 25. And then 1.2 million for the 26 to 40 bracket, and then 66 and older represented just shy of 1.5 million of the ballots cast. There were several notable events to this election, and I'm sure the last one bullet point is the one that sticks out in most people's mind. But you are obviously a civically engaged group, so I don't think it'll come as any surprise that I've noted these two other key points. So with this election, we actually implemented, this was the largest election where we implemented voter ID and the changes that had taken place from Senate Bill 747 for changes to same-day registration. We had already implemented voter ID in the fall of 2023, and it was still in effect for the primary and second primary. But in terms of actual people we needed to reach to inform them of this requirement, that was certainly this presidential election. Similarly, we had to make sure that people were informed about the changes to same-day registration. And while it didn't necessarily look like a big change to people who opted to register during the early voting period using the same-day registration method, for those administering the elections at the county and state level, we had to move quickly on sending out those verification cards. And a person who did not, that verification card was not delivered with that first mailing, we had to take steps to remove that ballot for that same day registrant. So, but there were actions they could take to cure it, but that was a change because we would normally go through the two verification cards or mailing where we send out the the voter registration cards. That was our normal processes, but that had been changed through Senate Bill 747. We also, North Carolina is notable for being first in the nation to send out absentee by mail ballots in even years, in presidential years. We would have done that the first week of September. However, You may recall we had an issue arise where RFK Jr. wanted his name removed from the ballot. The state board deemed it too late, but through court action, that was ordered for us to reprint the ballots without his name. And so we did that. That was a new proofing, new restuffing of the envelopes and so forth, because we were prepared for the original date. But it meant that we got the military and overseas citizen ballots sent out September 20th. And then on the 24th, we mailed to civilian requests that we had. And it so happened that the timing of that was the same week that as Hurricane Helene moved in and just caused such devastation in the mountains of North Carolina. And so I've got some things to discuss with that, because I think that is, at least we have been in the spotlight for a lot of reasons. Obviously, we were a battleground state, but how we were able to respond and pivot so quickly and still provide voting during Hurricane Helene is certainly something that we've gained national, all the way up to national, international attention, actually. As these are some photos that the counties have provided to us. The map highlights the 25 counties that were designated as disaster relief areas. But in reality, many of them had damage, all 25 had some degree of damage, but there were about 13 or 14 counties that were the most affected. And so it was those counties that we zeroed in on as the state board took action for emergency relief. Those provisions rolled into some legislation that was unanimously passed and allowed for us to make special provisions for the voters and the administration in those counties. It was a very short window of time given the degree of devastation. In 19 days, we got all county offices back open. In that first week, there were about 14 that were not open. And we got those back up and running. There was no damage to any of the county election offices, to any of their voting equipment, or even to the ballots that had been prepared. So that meant that we were able to go forward with absentee by mail voting, and working with the Postal Service and so forth, and preparing for early voting. And so on the first day of early voting, October the 17th, we opened in every single county. Now, the counties that were affected by Helene, they could modify their schedule, and some had to not have all sites open. But remarkably, we had 76 of the 80 planned sites open in those disaster declared counties. And a testament to the work and partnership that we have with state emergency management and the utility providers and so forth, they were able to have power at every one of those early voting sites in the disaster declared counties. And I was on site. It was remarkable, the sense of community, to learn that people were waiting in line. It was 30 degrees that morning that early voting opened, and there were lines in these counties that had been so devastated by Helene. As the legislature met another time, they did enact legislation that required 2 of our counties to add additional sites based upon a ratio of sites to the number of registered voters in that county. And so in that final week, there were 4 additional sites that were open in Henderson and McDowell. 3 were in Henderson, 1 additional site in McDowell. And I will point out, I'll go back to these photos just for your knowledge. These photos here are from McDowell County. The site that reopened in that final week was in Old Fort. That is Old Fort's interstate sign for the exit. So that tells you how high the waters rose, and part of why they were not able to initially open that Old Fort site and only had voting taking place in the county seat of Marion. The other factors, of which just what was so remarkable is there we were watching people turn out to vote when they didn't even have a roof over their head in some cases, or they had lost loved ones uh, in the storm. And yet they outpaced the rest of the state in their early voting turnout. And so when we closed out early voting, we were able to report that 59% of registered voters in those affected counties had turned out for early voting. And that was 2 percentage points higher than what we were seeing across the rest of the state. And we also had special provisions for folks who were affected to turn in their absentee by mail ballot in a county anywhere in the state or at the State Board of Elections. Their near relatives could turn it in for them too. And we had about 300 affected voters who chose to drop off their absentee by mail ballot outside of their county of registration. And the reason why is because the Postal Service was affected as well. We were in communication with the Postal Service within the first few business days after Helene hit. If you remember, it came in on Thursday, really did its number on Friday, and we had to work through the weekend to even make contact with our county officials to make sure that they were okay, and learned that in Marshall, for example, the post office was devastated. They set up a special mobile unit, and we worked hand in hand with the Postal Service to make sure that delivery could occur to the county boards of elections, and that there was a way for voters to pick up their mail if they were not able to have delivery at their home because the mailbox was washed away, their home was washed away, whatever the circumstance, or the road was washed away to preventing delivery. So those were considerations we had to make. And there was so much else going on. I'm happy to go into more detail about how we had to set up communications. Cell phone service was lacking. We had to have special letters written so that they could be in their offices beyond curfew, things of that nature, that just would go, wouldn't be on the the radar for most people of the kind of things that we were navigating through in our delivery of voting. Here is a polling place. This is in Polk County. And you can see how high the mud is. And that's a tree at the same site that's down. This bridge, I believe, is part of the Green River Gorge. But I show this as an example of resiliency. The vast majority of our election day polling sites were open, and that's nearly 2,700 sites. And so, and that includes in the counties of devastation. We had very few that had to be merged together. We looked for opportunities that if we couldn't use the actual facility, could we use a facility across the road or nearby so that voters were not displaced from where they were accustomed to voting on election day. We had the opportunity to use tents provided through State Emergency Management and FEMA. And going into, we never even had to set up a tent for early voting. And as we were working towards election day, initially we thought we would need maybe as many as 15 tents. Ultimately, we had 7 that were set up, most of those in Yancey County, who needed 4. Buncombe, Burke, and Haywood each had just 1 tent due to a facility that could not be used. And so these tents, I have pictures of them. are very much like what you see people use for wedding receptions and so forth, but they serve for the purpose of voting. You can see the double door entry, the mats that make them accessible. There was security, there was heat, there was lighting, there was a covered floor, and they worked fantastic. We also utilized a tent that had been set up. One of the tents in Yancey County was actually one set up through a nonprofit organization in an isolated community where ultimately we were able to gain access through at least a temporary road or an alternate route into every isolated community. But initially, there was a community in Yancey County where we were going to use the tent and did use the tent that had been set up by a nonprofit, but we had to cross the river in a four-wheel drive vehicle to even deliver that. And this community was about 100 folks that were isolated. None of them were precinct official, yet 6 folks, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and 2 unaffiliated, approached the elections folks and said, if you'll train us, we'll make sure our neighbors are able to vote. So just a real remarkable set of circumstances of how everyone locked arms, rallied together, and were just as committed as I ever was, the board members ever were, about making sure that we took voting to the people and that everyone had opportunity to vote. In the end, certification, we had no delay in getting the results in from those hurricane affected counties. We had results for election night from all 100 counties reported. We then went through our canvass period where we dealt with provisional ballots, which included those individuals who had indicated that they didn't have an acceptable form of ID and had used the exception form. We also had a new deadline for when absentee ballots had to arrive by, which was the close of polls on election night, so 7:30 p.m. So we dealt with those ballots. And then our law still provides that military and citizens living abroad can get their ballot dated by election day, but to us by the day before canvass. And so the counties met to canvass and certify the vote on November the 15th. And then the state board met on the 26th. We certified all contests except, most people, y'all would probably be aware, but a lot of people don't realize that we're not actually certifying the presidential election. We are certifying the electors, and the actual cast of those votes takes place at the Electoral College. That went off as planned, and that is conducted by the Secretary of State. It's really the one element of elections that we are not responsible for. The Secretary of State oversees the Electoral College. We did have some contests that were under recount. We had a number of recounts that took place in this election, including going to a sample hand count in the state Supreme Court Associate Justice seat. And we had some protests around that and a few legislative seats. Since that time, we have issued the certificates of election for all contests except for the North Carolina Supreme Court Associate Justice seat that is held by Justice Riggs and as the incumbent, and the challenger Judge Griffin. And so we have not issued that because of court order, as that contest proceeds through both state and federal court in its consideration. Helen, I'm not sure if I've covered everything you wanted me to cover, but that's what I'd put together as slides, and just wanted to provide my contact information. You can also learn so much through our state board website, ncsbe.gov, and you can follow us on social media. We're very proud of our efforts to educate folks through social media, which includes Instagram, Facebook, X, formerly known as Twitter, and LinkedIn.
Good. That sounds great. That's a really, really fantastic account of the elections. Johanna, did we have some questions? I saw one. I
Yes,
only saw one question.
I have a couple questions too. If anybody else has any questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat and I'd be happy to read them out for you. The one we have right now, Naomi Lambert wanted to know how the counties that were the Hurricane Helene disaster declared counties, coped, the ones who had new election directors? Do you
So
have any feedback on that?
if there can be, some luck in a disaster situation, I would say that we had some in this regard. We have actually had a change in county election directors since 2019 in 62 changes. And more than 30 of our directors going into this presidential election had never been the director for a presidential election. Now, many of these folks did have elections experience, but many did not. And for the vast majority of the counties affected by Hurricane Helene, especially those 14 or so that were most affected, they were experienced directors or experienced election folks. So that really helped us to be prepared. The other aspect that, even for those who are newer in that district, we have done extensive efforts to prepare for continuity of operation plans, crisis communication plans, disaster recovery plans, and have worked those efforts with state emergency management, local emergency management. There's an organization of county IT professionals. NICLGISA, North Carolina Local Government Information System Association, you know why they call themselves NICLGISA. They were involved, local law enforcement, in many exercises, and really one of the cornerstones of my tenure has been to really develop those partnerships, because we didn't know it would be Hurricane Helene, but we know that we are going to face challenges. It could be a cyber attack. It could be a natural disaster. It could be, something, even when I was a county elections director, I had a polling place burn and just before the election, and we had to relocate. And just, being prepared for a singular event or something much broader like Helene, we had exercised that and developed these working relationships that saw us through. We also have field support that are out in these areas. The field specialist that serves most of these counties lived in Asheville. He actually walked 4 miles one way to be able to go to the Buncombe County office so that he could be of assistance to not just Buncombe, but so many others. And so I think that, whether it be the newness of some of the directors or the experience that so many had, I think we had really solidified a game plan, not knowing that it would be Helene. And I think it served us well that those new directors in other parts of the state had field support. We had gone through extensive training, provided extensive tools to them, to where they were really able to be pretty self-sufficient so that we could give that extra energy and effort to getting the Helene affected counties back up and running.
The next question is from Lynn Edmonds. She said, can you please review the changes with the most recent bill passed with respect to counting ballot deadlines?
Yes. So I'm sure that's referencing Senate Bill 382. And I'll stop sharing my screen now. I don't know that that's needed at this point. So Senate Bill 382, which was titled Disaster Relief, actually was about 131 pages. And within it was a section 3 that made changes to the State Board of Elections in the appointment authority and how that's going to be handled effective May 1. And then there were changes to the administration of election, particularly around absentee by mail ballots and provisional ballots. And so we're working through how this will actually be put into effect. But the gist of it is that the county boards will need to continue their absentee board meetings for any ballots that are received on election day. So remember, I said that those have to be in by 7:30 p.m. So any ballots that are received after they have their afternoon meeting, or even the ones that they receive but they may not have dealt with during their election day afternoon, in up until the deadline, they would be required to continue their meeting into the night until those are put through the tabulator. We have expressed concern about this because this may mean that, you know, county boards of elections are still meeting at midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., because the staff doesn't just put them in front of the board. They have to, check those into the system, and a variety of verifications that we go through even before we put them before the board. And then if there's any concerns around, the voter ID requirement or witnesses and things like that, then our time to deal with those has been abbreviated. And that and provisional ballots we're being required to deal with those by Friday following the election on Tuesday. And that's a pretty big hurdle. We usually have 10 days to work through that, and we work into the night to deal with those during that 10-day period. And we had counties struggling to be ready for their county canvas and even into the state board canvas on some of these matters. So, that went into effect, obviously just before Christmas. And so we're working now at, how to, what would be required for implementation of such. And one of the things I didn't highlight, but was still something we had to work through this election as well, was the largest election where we've had to close out the early voting tabulators after or at the time that the polls close, rather than during the absentee board meeting held on election day. And so this, you may have noticed, meant a lag in those results being uploaded because we could not close them out and upload at 7:30 p.m. So, with this change in 382, there's going to be a lot happening at the county boards of elections at 7:30 p.m. and after, as precinct results come in, as we deal with these absentees, and as we deal with the closeout of early voting, and get supplies back into the offices on Tuesday and Wednesday. So those are the highlights. The other part, as I mentioned, is the change in the appointment. The auditor would appoint the state board of elections May 1. The state board would then, the executive director is a 2-year appointment as it already, but they would be meeting to decide the executive director person by May 15th. And then the state board would select the county board members as they already do. But the auditor would select the chair of the county board of elections, which has been a task of the governor up until now. So that's what we're looking at. There has been a lawsuit that was filed while Governor Cooper was still, that was filed on the 23rd. So it's Governor Cooper and Governor-elect Stein. And now, obviously, Governor Stein will see that court case through, and we'll see where that goes.
So the next question, I have 2 questions about the 60,000 ballots. So I'm going to combine those together. There's similar questions about what happens with these 60,000 ballots that are invalid, and the other races that are not under contest. What happens with, do those get counted? Can they cure their voter registration? What happens with those?
So I have to limit what I say because we're in litigation.
Right.
And obviously I'm party to that litigation in my capacity. But the matter, the question at hand is the Griffin campaign has identified around 60,000 voters primarily focused on absentee and early voters and those citizens living abroad, as not having proper their driver's license or social security number recorded in our system, and indicating that their ballots should not be counted, seeking a remedy. If there's a couple of remedies. One would be that because we can retrieve the ballot of absentee or early voting voters, that we would do that if confirmed that we do not have their driver's license or social security number. But there could be a remedy of calling for a new election. There could be a remedy of declaring a winner. So we will see how that plays out. It is happening in parallel at the state Supreme Court and the federal court right now. And I will say that the data matching that the Griffin campaign has done does not necessarily reflect that these individuals are not properly registered voters. We have sent information out and provided to the counties that an individual can go in and provide that information, or reach out to their county board of elections to determine, do we have it on file, maybe just not electronically to where it would show up in those data queries. And because some of these voters have been registered for that long, but that doesn't necessarily, we don't know if the courts will consider that to be a remedy if it's provided at this point in time.
Gotcha.
So
it's a wait and see.
It's very much a wait and see, though. Hopefully a soon to see.
Are those ballots invalid for only one race, or would all the races be considered invalid? Or is that still?
Yeah, the protest is for this individual race. There were some legislative seats where it was protested as well, but for obviously a different number of ballots or voters. Those individuals, we did issue the certificates for those legislative contests, and they have been sworn in. So the likelihood of those being challenged, I can't remember if that window has closed now, but there is a way to contest in the legislature, but I think that window has now closed. But don't hold me to that. I'm not the attorney on staff. And so the way that it's been described to me is, and the way I've always held as an election professional, once an election is certified, it is certified, and that person, takes their oath and moves forward. So we do not anticipate an interpretation that would decertify other contests. So this is strictly as we know it, focused on this one contest.
Thank you. I'm going to change the subject. We have some other questions about that, but since we only have a few minutes left, Candace Blackley asked, do you know how many ballots came in late due to the change in deadline? I think she's talking about absentee by mail, and therefore could not be counted.
I think that is the question, and I don't have that number off the top of my head or in front of me, so I can try to follow up on that. But
that would be on the State Board of Elections website.
I believe we've published that, but don't hold me to that either, because with all the other things going on, we don't have everything published that we collect data on.
You have a lot of good data on that website, though, I will say.
Thank you. We are considered to have more data available publicly than any state elections operation in the country. So we take great pride in that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Let me see. Do you have time for one more?
I do.
I want you to be late to class. Hang on, sorry. Some came in while I was talking. If it took Griffin so long to call out the 60K ballots, how can the request be valid? Is there a deadline on that?
I would encourage folks to read the dissent by Justice Dietz from the state Supreme Court recently. I think his dissent actually describes the quandary that they have about around that very matter. Because what's being called into question is, it's called the Purcell principle. I sound like I have a law degree. The Purcell principle is actually from federal court, but it's been applied to state cases, and it's about whether you do you change the rules? Do you change up anything about an election once the election is underway? And I think that, and he poses that same question about whether you can question the eligibility of voters after an election, or if that would have had to have been resolved prior to the election.
Well, I'm gonna give it back to Helen. Thank you again for
Thank
all the
you.
information and answering the questions. And y'all did a really great job this election, especially with all the challenges. So,
well, appreciate that. I have been trying to convey that too. I'm glad that others are seeing it, and
we definitely saw it. Yeah.
trying to say that to the county elections directors, because, you know, for us, it doesn't end on election night. It certainly goes through our certification period, but then when you know, it's prolonged with recounts and contests that are decided by 734 votes. You know, it's a little anticlimactic, and they do need to realize that they really did pull off something pretty close to phenomenal. And we're never going to be perfect in election administration, but, you know, my hat goes off to them and the people that I'm so fortunate to work with, for their tenacity to try to perfect the processes while still making sure that every eligible voter can cast their ballot.
And Karen, this event was just fantastic. All your explanations and what you all went through going out to those areas and taking care of things and dragging your tents with you. It was just an amazing process. And we so much appreciate the work that you and your group have done. And of course, all the county folks too. So it was really fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Any other questions right now?
I just want to say that you are so articulate and knowledgeable about such a wide berth of information. I am so impressed. I'm glad you're there. I'm glad you're in that office.
Thank you, Dale. I hope I get to continue. We'll see how that all plays out. But you know, I think to that, I will say that's not about me. I think that's the role of an election professional. The number of hats that you wear to work in this field. I don't try to diminish what others do for a living, but you all have a better appreciation than most of really all the hats that are required. And you know, but when you love the work that you do, you kind of drink it in and it becomes a part of you. And I'm glad that comes through. And thank you for having me tonight. Thank you for the shout out to the county officials. Thank you for all the support through, especially Helene. That was very personal for me, because even though I grew up in Eastern North Carolina, I called the Asheville area home for 20 years. So that was a driving force as well. But thank y'all. And a shout out to my cousin. She messaged me. I didn't realize she was beyond, but Cynthia Harden and I are related. So, hey, cousin.
That's great. That's great. Well, Mark, a true professional, and we certainly appreciate so much. So thank you so much.